The stun gun crackled through the air, followed by a scream that shattered the morning silence. James Sullivan sprinted across his living room, heart hammering, as he watched his sister Amelia collapse to the ground, her body convulsing from the electric shock. The air smelled of burnt fabric, and the HOA security officer who had fired the taser stood unmoved, hand still on his weapon. "What the hell have you done?" James roared, dropping to his knees beside Amelia. She gasped for air, pain twisting her face as she tried to move. Standing smugly in the doorway was Veronica Blake, the power-hungry president of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA, arms crossed over her designer blazer. "This is what happens when people don't follow the rules," she said coldly. James clenched his fists, rage burning in his veins. He had served overseas, fought in war zones, but never had he seen this level of unchecked tyranny in his own country, on his own doorstep. The warning signs had been there from the start. First, a $50 fine for unauthorized guest parking. Then, a series of ridiculous violations. His trash bins weren't placed exactly 6 inches from the curb, his grass was half an inch too tall, and worst of all, his sister's car was towed for simply existing on a public street. But this was war. James watched in horror as his sister struggled to sit up, the taser burns still fresh on her chest. His hands trembled as he dialed 911, his voice shaking with fury. "My sister has just been attacked in my own home by HOA security. Send the police and an ambulance, now." Behind him, Veronica Blake stood unfazed, adjusting the gold HOA pin on her blazer. "You brought this on yourself, Mr. Sullivan. Perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." James clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You think you can get away with this?" Veronica smirked. "Oh, I don't think, James. I know." The sound of sirens blaring in the distance made her stiffen. The smug confidence in her eyes flickered for just a moment. She hadn't expected him to fight back this fast. As Amelia was rushed to the hospital, James made a vow. If Veronica wanted a war, she'd get one. By the time James returned home, his nightmare had only just begun. A new violation notice was nailed to his door, a bright red warning reading, "Final notice, unsightly property, $1,500 fine, immediate payment required." His front yard was covered in dozens of small orange flags, each marking a so-called violation. Grass 1 inch too tall, $100. Decorative rocks not HOA approved, $200. Unauthorized wind chimes, $75. But the worst was yet to come. As James ripped the notice from his door, he spotted a tow truck flashing its lights down the street. 2 uniformed men were hooking chains onto Amelia's car, again. "Stop," James bellowed, sprinting toward them. "You have no authority to take that car." Veronica, standing smugly on the sidewalk, held up a clipboard. "Actually, we do. Section 7B of the HOA bylaws states that unapproved residents cannot keep personal vehicles on the premises." James gritted his teeth. "That's public street parking," she smiled. "Not anymore." The tow truck driver hesitated, looking uneasy. "Look, man, we're just following orders." James pulled out his phone, hitting record. "If you take that car, I will sue you for unlawful towing. And you," he pointed at Veronica, "are going to answer for this harassment in court." For the first time, her smirk faltered. James turned the camera toward the tow truck driver. "Are you sure you want to be a part of this?" A long pause. Then, the chains were unhooked. The truck backed away. James exhaled sharply, but he knew this wasn't over. Should James fight back harder? Comment, #HOA corruption, if you think he should take them to court. And don't forget, like if you think Veronica's reign of terror needs to end, subscribe for the next shocking twist. James slammed the front door behind him, his mind racing. This wasn't just about fines anymore, this was a full-scale attack. Veronica Blake wasn't just a tyrant on a power trip, she had an agenda. He stormed into the kitchen, throwing down the latest violation notices onto the counter. $1,500 for unsightly property? $500 for unauthorized wind chimes? They were fabricating reasons to drain his bank account. Amelia, still sore from the taser attack, winced as she sat at the dining table. "James, this isn't just random harassment. I think I know what's going on." She opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. I spent the last hour digging through county property records. James leaned over her shoulder as a map appeared on the screen. Certain houses in Oak Ridge Heights were highlighted in red, 7 in total. These homes, Amelia said, tapping the screen, were all sold in the last 6 months. Every single one of them was bought by shell companies. And guess who owns those shell companies? James's stomach tightened. Tell me. She clicked another tab. Blackstone Holdings. James exhaled sharply. Wait, the real estate development firm? Amelia nodded. And guess who sits on their advisory board? James didn't need her to say it. Veronica Blake. It all made sense. The sudden rise in HOA violations, the endless fines, the pressure to move. This wasn't about enforcing neighborhood rules. It was a calculated effort to push homeowners out, drive down property values, and let Blackstone Holdings swoop in to buy up the land for next to nothing. They're running a property scam, Amelia said, voice tight. Veronica is weaponizing HOA regulations to force people out of their homes. James clenched his jaw. They want my house, she nodded. Your property sits at the corner of the proposed main entrance for their new development. They need it to expand. James leaned back, running a hand through his hair. They weren't just coming after him. They were coming after the entire neighborhood. A sudden thought hit him. What about the houses next to the ones already sold? Amelia clicked again. Another map loaded, this time with more homes highlighted. His, along with 4 others. These properties, she said, are the ones being targeted next. James felt the blood drain from his face. A knock at the door snapped him back to reality. He exchanged a look with Amelia before walking cautiously toward it. Through the peephole, he saw Ellen, his elderly neighbor, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. Her hands were shaking. James opened the door and she shoved the paper into his chest. I just got this, she stammered. He unfolded it. Final notice. Failure to comply will result in property liens and legal action. James's heart pounded. The war was no longer just personal. Veronica wasn't just coming for him. She was coming for them all. James barely had time to process Ellen's trembling hands and the final notice she had just shoved at him when a sharp knock rattled his door again. This time, it wasn't a terrified neighbor. It was Veronica Blake. She stood tall, flanked by 2 of her HOA enforcers, burly men in black Valley Protection Services uniforms, their expressions unreadable behind dark sunglasses. James stepped onto the porch, blocking Ellen protectively. You've got some nerve showing up here, he growled. Veronica's lips curled into a knowing smirk. Mr. Sullivan, she drawled, glancing at Ellen. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. James said nothing, his fists clenching at his sides. She held up a thick folder of paperwork. Since you refuse to comply with HOA standards, we have no choice but to escalate this matter. This is a formal eviction notice. James felt his pulse spike. You can't evict me from my own home. Veronica sighed dramatically. James, you should really read the fine print. Per Section 14B of our bylaws, the HOA has the authority to seize properties with unpaid violations after 3 formal warnings. You've received 7. She tapped the folder against her palm. If you don't pay in full by Monday, the HOA will place a lien on your home. And once that happens, she shrugged. Well, foreclosure is just a matter of time. James gritted his teeth. Over some wind chimes in a parked car? Veronica's eyes gleamed. She wanted this reaction. She wanted him to break. That's the thing about rules, Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice like silk. They only apply to people who don't have the power to change them. The way she said it, so casually, so smug, made James's blood boil. A sharp snap echoed through the street as Amelia stepped out from behind him, flipping open a leather-bound portfolio. Well, Veronica, she said coolly, it just so happens that I specialize in real estate law, and I'd love to go over those bylaws with you. For the first time, Veronica hesitated. Oh, Miss Sullivan, she said, forcing a smile. Still recovering from your little incident, I see. Amelia's eyes narrowed. Trust me, I've been through worse. Veronica cocked her head. And yet, you still haven't learned your lesson. Before anyone could react, one of the security guards reached for Amelia's arm. She jerked back. Do not touch me. The second guard moved in, grabbing her wrist. James saw red. He lunged, shoving the man backward. The guard stumbled, crashing into the HOA's no loitering sign. The other guard yanked out a taser. "Don't," James started, but it was too late. The prongs shot forward, embedding into Amelia's side. A scream tore through the air as 50,000 volts surged through her body. She collapsed onto the pavement, convulsing violently. For a split second, everything was still. Then James snapped. With a roar, he tackled the guard to the ground. Fists flew, bones cracked, and the world blurred into a flurry of rage. Somewhere in the chaos, Veronica screamed. A neighbor shouted. Tires screeched. When James finally pulled himself up, his knuckles were raw and bleeding, and the guard lay groaning on the ground. Sirens wailed in the distance. Veronica, disheveled and pale, stumbled backward. You'll pay for this," she whispered. But James wasn't listening. He was already on his knees beside Amelia. Her breaths were ragged, her skin clammy, but her eyes flickered open. James exhaled shakily. "Stay with me, sis." She tried to speak but winced in pain. As paramedics swarmed in, James locked eyes with Veronica. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. The hospital lights buzzed faintly overhead as James sat beside Amelia's bed, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. The heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound a cruel reminder of what had just happened. His sister, his only family, had been tasered for the second time in as many days. By HOA security. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, the way she collapsed, the look of satisfaction on Veronica Blake's face. James exhaled slowly, trying to fight back the rage simmering in his chest. He had seen some monstrous people in his lifetime. He had watched corrupt politicians play games with people's lives overseas. But Veronica? She wasn't just power-hungry, she was dangerous. Amelia stirred, wincing as she shifted in bed. "James," she muttered weakly. He leaned in immediately. "I'm here." She let out a shaky breath. Did they arrest them?" James clenched his jaw. The police had shown up. Statements were taken, reports were filed. But in the end, Veronica walked away. "She called her lawyer," he said bitterly. "They twisted it into self-defense, claimed you lunged at security first." Amelia let out a weak, humorless chuckle. "Typical." James leaned forward. "This ends now, Amelia." She nodded, determination flickering in her exhausted eyes. "Then we need proof. Real, undeniable proof." James exhaled, his mind already racing. "We get their financial records. We connect her to Blackstone Holdings. We expose everything." Amelia looked at him, then winced as she tried to sit up. "Start with the fines, the shell companies. If we can prove fraud, we can shut them down." James nodded. He had spent years fighting for justice in a corrupt system. He wasn't about to let some HOA dictator steal everything he had built. By the time James left the hospital, the neighborhood was in chaos. Cars lined the streets. Neighbors were gathered on lawns, talking in hushed, frantic voices. The attack on Amelia had spread like wildfire through the community. And then he saw it. A black SUV with tinted windows sat idling at the end of the street. James slowed his steps, his instincts flaring. The moment he made eye contact, the SUV peeled away, tires screeching. He didn't need to see the plates to know they were watching. He turned, marching toward his house, his mind laser-focused. The second he stepped inside, he grabbed his laptop and hacked into the public property records. If Veronica thought she could play dirty, she was about to learn. James played to win. And he never lost. The breaking point. Secrets exposed, threats escalate. James sat hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The house was dark except for the faint glow of his screen, but his mind was sharper than ever. He was done waiting. Done playing by their rules. Veronica Blake and her corrupt HOA weren't just bullies. They were criminals. And he was about to prove it. After hours of digging through public records, zoning permits, and financial transactions, James finally struck gold. A single document buried in county records. It was a land acquisition agreement, one that listed several properties in Oak Ridge Heights already marked for redevelopment. At the bottom, 2 names were signed. Blackstone Holdings CEO Veronica Blake, Community Liaison. James let out a sharp breath. He had her. The homes being targeted? They were all owned by people Veronica had fined relentlessly. This wasn't about community standards. It was a real estate takeover. But James wasn't the only one working in the shadows. Just as he was about to screenshot the files, his internet connection cut out. The screen flickered, then went black. "What the hell?" James muttered. Then came a noise outside, a sharp rustling, the sound of movement near his front yard. James's heartbeat spiked. He moved slowly to the window, peering through the blinds. Two shadowy figures stood near his mailbox. One held a canister. The other struck a match. Fire. James bolted for the door. "Hey!" he roared, yanking it open. The two figures froze, then sprinted. James gave chase, but they were fast, disappearing into the night. He skidded to a stop near his mailbox, where the flames were already licking up the wooden post. The paper stapled to it was already half burned, but James could still make out two chilling words. "Final warning." The flames reflected off his clenched jaw, rage burning hotter than the fire itself. They thought they could scare him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. James stormed back inside, grabbed his phone, and hit dial. Amelia picked up on the first ring. "They just tried to burn my damn house down," James growled. There was silence. Then, "That was a mistake." She sounded calm. Too calm. "What do you have?" James asked. Amelia's voice was ice cold. "Enough to bury them." The war had officially begun. The war begins. HOA's darkest secret. Exposed. James paced his living room, his pulse pounding. The half-burned warning still sat on his kitchen counter, the acrid scent of smoke clinging to his clothes. Veronica Blake had finally crossed the line. "They're getting desperate," Amelia's voice crackled through the phone. "That means we're close." James exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. "How much do we have?" "Enough to blow this wide open," she replied. "Bank statements, shell company records, even a leaked memo from Blackstone Holdings outlining their aggressive acquisition strategy." James's jaw tightened. This wasn't just corruption, it was organized theft. And they were about to tear it all down. That night, James and Amelia gathered their neighbors, the ones Veronica had tried to break. The air was thick with tension as James projected the evidence onto his TV screen. "This is it," he said, voice firm. "This is how they've been targeting us." Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Dawson's hands trembled as she gripped her fine notice. "They forced me to sell. They told me I had no choice." Rob clenched his fists. "And they tried to do the same to us." Amelia clicked to the final page. "The HOA," she said, "isn't just enforcing rules. They're working with Blackstone to drive us out." Silence. Then a slow, seething fury spread through the room. They weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters. Just as James was about to lay out their plan, a car screeched to a stop outside. His stomach dropped. Through the window, he saw two men in black suits step out of a sleek, unmarked SUV. His blood ran cold. These weren't HOA goons. These were professionals. A heavy knock rattled the front door. James exchanged a glance with Amelia. She nodded. Slowly, he opened it. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes like steel, gave him a thin smile. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "we'd like to have a word." James felt the weight of the moment press down on him. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was war. James locked eyes with the suited man standing on his porch, his gut tightening. This wasn't just about HOA fines anymore. It was bigger. "Step outside, Mr. Sullivan," the man said smoothly. "We'd like to discuss an opportunity." James didn't move. He could feel Amelia behind him, quietly reaching for her phone. "I'm not interested," James said flatly. The man chuckled, exchanging a glance with his partner. "That's a shame. We were hoping to resolve this peacefully." James clenched his jaw. "Like how you resolved Mrs. Dawson's foreclosure, or how you handled Amelia." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "I'd think carefully before making accusations you can't prove," he said, stepping forward. A loud click echoed through the room. James didn't have to turn to know Amelia had just started recording. The suited man hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Before either of them could react, the street lit up with flashing red and blue lights. Police cruisers flooded the cul-de-sac. Doors slammed. Officers swarmed. And behind them, a news van rolled up. This was it. The moment James and Amelia had worked for. Amelia stepped past James, holding up her phone. "We have you on record, gentlemen." The suited men said nothing. Then, Veronica Blake stepped out from the shadows. Her perfectly polished image cracked the second she saw the cameras. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "These people are criminals. They're defaming me." James smirked. "Defaming you? Let's ask the DAA." Tall figure stepped out of a police cruiser. "District Attorney Michael Reyes." James folded his arms. "We sent your office every piece of evidence, your shell companies, the illegal fines, the fraud." The DA held up a warrant. "Veronica Blake, you're under arrest." Veronica froze. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Neighbors stepped closer. "No, no, this isn't right. I built this community," she screamed, clawing at the officers as they pulled her hands behind her back. She turned, desperate, toward the suited men. "Do something." But they were already backing away. This wasn't their fight anymore. James watched as Veronica was shoved into the back of a squad car, her reign finally over. James's fight wasn't just about Oak Ridge Heights. It was about every neighborhood being manipulated by corrupt HOAs, greedy developers, and unchecked power. And in 2025, this fight is more real than ever. With rising property prices and corporate land grabs, more homeowners are facing the same fate. Forced out of their homes under false violations and shady legal loopholes. But this story proves something. Power only exists when people stay silent. When one person stands up, it creates a chain reaction. James and Amelia took a stand, and in doing so, they empowered an entire community. So the question is, who else is ready to fight back? With Veronica behind bars and Blackstone's scam exposed, what should James and Amelia do next? 1. Take this fight national, expose HOA corruption across the country. 2. Push for new laws to prevent illegal land grabs. 3. Stay and rebuild Oak Ridge Heights, making sure no HOA ever tries this again. Comment below. Let us know what you think. And if you stand with James and Amelia, hit that like button and share this story. This war might be over, but the real battle has just begun.